CDER. To outline today's event, the webinar in its entirety will run approximately 1.5 hours, which includes a Q&A session. And if you have questions now or during the webinar, please enter those questions into the Q&A chat pod. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Our speakers today include, first, Leonard Sachs, Associate Director, Clinical Methodologies, Office of Medical Policy in CDER. Next, we'll welcome Elizabeth Kunkoski, Health Science Policy Analyst, Clinical Methodologies, Office of Medical Policy, CDER. And our final speaker will be Kassa Ayalew, Director, Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation, Office of Scientific Investigation in CDER. Now, please join me in welcoming our first presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Sachs.
Good afternoon. My name is Leonard Sachs from the Office of Medical Policy, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar where we will be discussing our draft guidance entitled Electronic Systems, Electronic Records, and Electronic Signatures in Clinical Investigations, Questions and Answers. And I'll be joined today by my colleagues Beth Kunkoski and Kassa Ayalew, who will delve into some of the details. I will begin with a couple of introductory remarks. As we all know, there are a myriad of ways in which electronic systems are used in clinical investigations to provide the records that FDA relies on. Electronic systems can be used to capture data in clinical trials, they can be used to copy data, they can be used to transfer data from one location to another or from one system to another, they can be used to store data, and they can be used for data analysis. And they may apply to many different records. For example, they may apply to trial data, to source documents, informed consent, required forms, tracking of product, agreement with contract research organizations, and so on. Our Part 11 regulations were written in 1997, and they were designed to ensure the integrity of electronic records and signatures. They apply to those electronic records and signatures that are required by FDA regulations or by predicate rules. And the Part 11 requirements include a list of controls to ensure that electronic records and signatures are equivalent to paper records. And these controls include the need for validation of electronic systems to make sure their function is intended, the need for audit trails that we're able to trace data elements and any changes that are made to them, the need for access controls to make sure that we have attributability of records and we can determine who entered them, the need for protection of records during the record retention period so that they can be inspected, and the training of people using these electronic systems to make electronic records. In the 26 years since Part 11 regulations were published, there's been enormous progress in electronic data capture and management. There have been many changes in the way electronic systems and records are obtained and managed. Many electronic functions are outsourced to service providers who are not part of the healthcare system. For example, cloud storage and computational systems, commercial off-the-shelf software for data management that can be purchased, and electronic signature packages that are produced by vendors. Clinical trial data may also be obtained from real-world data sources like electronic health records, which are not subject to FDA regulations. Digital health technologies are another area where we see a new source of electronic clinical data. The internet has become a new and most widely used vehicle for data transfer. Electronic data flow between systems has become more efficient and more prevalent, and electronic signatures, audit trails, and encryption are in widespread use in many different sectors: healthcare, banking, commerce, and income tax. So how do we ensure that data integrity in these situations? What's new in this draft guidance? Over the years, FDA has published several guidances to keep pace with the changing electronic environment. The draft guidance we're discussing today, when finalized, will replace our prior guidance entitled The Use of Electronic Records and Electronic Signatures in Clinical Investigations under 21 CFR Part 11, questions and answers, which we wrote in 2017. In preparing this draft guidance, we've attempted to address the many public comments we've received in previous dockets and the many questions that have been submitted directly to the agency. The major differences between this and the prior draft guidance revolve around real-world data, which is data that's obtained generally during the course of clinical care and is not specifically designed for clinical investigations. We talk about non-US sites, recognizing that a very large proportion of our trials take place globally, and some of these are not conducted under IND. We talk about validation using a risk-based approach, which takes into account commercial off-the-shelf software and customized systems. We talk about certified copies and their relationship to our Part 11 requirements. We talk a little bit about digital health technologies. These are instruments that are used to record data directly from patients, things such as cell phones, smartwatches, glucose monitors, and activity trackers. And we talk about electronic data transfer. My first bullet indicates that we've added a number of other centers within FDA to this guidance. As far as the goals and limitations of this guidance go, I think it's important to realize that given the enormous range of circumstances involving electronic records and the large variety of programs that are used to process them, it's really not possible to address every specific use case. Our goal in this guidance is to outline the principles for ensuring integrity of electronic records that can be broadly applied. I want to emphasize that this is a draft guidance and we will review all public comments in detail as we prepare to finalize this draft. So at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Beth Kunkoski to begin going systematically through some of the aspects of the guidance.
Thank you, Leonard. My name is Beth Kunkoski. I'm a Health Science Policy Analyst in CDER's Office of Medical Policy. Today, I will provide an overview of the guidance, electronic systems, electronic records, and electronic signatures in clinical investigations, questions, and answers. In my presentation, I will provide an overview of each of the main sections of the guidance. Kassa Ayalew will then provide an overview of the guidance from the Office of Scientific Investigations perspective regarding inspections. The main sections of the guidance include electronic records, electronic systems, information technology service providers and services, digital health technologies, and electronic signatures. Leonard provided background on why Part 11 is important and how, even as technology and methods for data collection change, we still need to consider the quality and integrity of data used for regulatory purposes. Now, sponsors have the opportunity to use real-world data sources in marketing applications. In general, Part 11 applies to these data sources. However, FDA recognizes that some of these sources, such as EHRs or registries, are not originally created in Part 11 compliance systems and may still be used for marketing applications. In these situations, sponsors should still ensure the quality and integrity of electronic records to support marketing applications. As many clinical investigations now include non-US or foreign clinical investigation sites, it's not always clear if Part 11 applies. Electronic records from non-US clinical investigation sites, which are not conducted under an investigational new drug application, investigational device exemption application, or investigational new animal drug file, should be credible and accurate. The quality of data should be comparable to data collected under an IND, IDE, or INAD. One of the most common questions we receive about Part 11 relates to certified copies. FDA has adopted the ICH E6 R2 Good Clinical Practice definition of a certified copy, which is a copy of the original record that has the same information, including data that describe the context, content, and structure as the original. Certified copies must be verified by a dated signature or by generation through a validated process such as scanning or printing. Copies may be maintained and retained in place of the original records, which means when you create electronic certified copies, paper copies do not need to be retained. Copies should include the date and time when they are created, and written standard operating procedures should be developed to ensure consistency. Question 6 discusses electronic transmission of electronic records. Part 11 does not specifically address electronic communication methods used in the transmission of records, such as email. The regulated entity is responsible for ensuring the secure transfer of records. Audit trails should capture the date and time and originators of those records. Section B of the guidance discusses electronic systems used to produce and manage electronic records in a clinical investigation. Kassa will cover a lot more about electronic systems, validation, and the documentation that should be maintained associated with those systems. Some examples of electronic systems include those that manage electronic case report forms or electronic trial master files. This section of the guidance discusses many more examples. Security safeguards are the procedures and processes in place to safeguard the authenticity, integrity, and when appropriate, confidentiality of electronic records. Access controls need to be in place to limit system access. A risk-based approach should be utilized when creating those access controls. Records should be used to track authorized personnel and their access privileges. Security safeguards such as firewalls and antivirus software should be in place and continually updated. Security breaches should be reported to FDA and IRBs. Section C of the guidance covers information technology service providers and their services. IT service vendors provide services such as data hosting, cloud computing, software, platform, and infrastructure services. Sponsors and other regulated entities are responsible for ensuring that electronic records produced by IT service vendors meet applicable Part 11 regulatory requirements, such as accurate and complete records, access controls, audit trails, data security, and confidentiality. Kassa will discuss more about contracts that should be in place with vendors and inspection expectations. Section D of the guidance covers digital health technologies. A digital health technology is a system that uses computing platforms, connectivity, software, and/or sensors for healthcare and related uses. DHTs may take the form of hardware and/or software, and in many instances may run on a general-purpose computing platform, such as a mobile phone. In December 2021, FDA published a draft guidance on digital health technologies for remote data acquisition and clinical investigations. The Part 11 guidance we're discussing today should be used in combination with this guidance when designing your clinical investigation utilizing digital health technologies. Next, the guidance addresses what is the data originator if a DHT is used to collect data. For patient-reported outcome measures, such as the patient recording information on a mobile app on their smartphone, the trial participant is considered the data originator. If the DHT transmits data automatically, such as an activity tracker or cardiac monitor, the DHT itself is the data originator. The sponsor should develop and maintain a list of authorized data originators for each clinical investigation. Question 22 of the guidance discusses the transfer of data from the DHT to the electronic data repository. Data from a DHT is generally transferred to a durable electronic data repository, such as an EDC system, a clinical investigation site database, and/or a vendor database. Transmission should occur contemporaneously or as soon as possible after data are generated. The date and time the data are transferred from the DHT to the electronic data repository should be included in the audit trail. Source data captured by a DHT can be subsequently moved from one durable electronic data repository to another using a validated process. DHT source data. Electronic source data are considered to be located in the first durable electronic data repository to which the data are transferred. When the data captured by the DHT, including all associated metadata, are securely transferred to and retained in the durable electronic data repository, according to the sponsor's pre-specified plan, then FDA does not intend to inspect individual DHTs for source data. Section E of the guidance covers electronic signatures. The first few slides are a summary of what is defined in the regulations. An electronic signature is a computer data compilation of any symbol or series of symbols executed, adopted, or authorized by an individual to be the legally binding equivalent of an individual's handwritten signature. Part 11 specifies that the electronic signature must contain the printed name of the signer, the date and time when the signature was executed, and the meaning associated with the signature, such as a document is approved or has been reviewed. Electronic signatures must be linked to the respective electronic records to ensure that the signatures cannot be excised, copied, or otherwise transferred to falsify an electronic record by ordinary means. Electronic signatures drawn with a finger or an electronic stylus are not considered electronic signatures. These are in fact handwritten signatures. Electronic signatures may also be based on biometrics based on the regulation. Question 24 of the guidance discusses methods for electronic signatures. Part 11 does not specify particular methods to create electronic signatures. Some common examples include ID cards, biometrics, digital signatures, or username and password combinations. There are now various commercial off-the-shelf or COTS electronic signature services available to create electronic signatures. Sponsors, investigators, and other regulated entities should ensure that these COTS services conform to Part 11 requirements based on information provided by the vendors or the sponsor's own validation of the services when warranted. Question 28 asks if FDA certifies individual electronic systems or methods used to obtain electronic signatures, such as Adobe or DocuSign. FDA does not certify these individual vendor services. Sponsors should work directly with vendors to ensure compliance with Part 11. On a different note from the guidance, FDA recently published a technical amendment for Part 11. Part 11 100C1 requires submission of a non-repudiation letter to certify a person's electronic signature is intended to be the legally binding equivalent of traditional handwritten signatures. You may now submit letters electronically through the Electronic Submission Gateway mailbox ESG helpdesk at fda.hhs.gov. A paper copy is no longer required. FDA has a webpage on non-repudiation letters, which always has the most up-to-date information. This is a draft guidance. We appreciate your comments on the guidance. Please submit them through the docket by May 15th. We will then review all docket comments and update the guidance as appropriate. Guidance is intended to identify policy regarding regulations. 21 CFR Part 11 remains in place and must be interpreted in our current technological environment. Please keep this in mind as you submit your docket comments. Thank you. That was all I had for today. Dr. Kassa Ayalew will present next. After his presentation, we will be available for questions and answers. After the webinar, if you think of additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the Office of Medical Policy mailbox cderomp@fda.hhs.gov. Thank you.
Welcome and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Kassa Ayalew. I'm the Director of the Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation in the Office of Scientific Investigations at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. As most of you know, GCP inspection plays a crucial role in clinical drug development to ensure the reliability and integrity of clinical trial data and to meet regulatory expectation for marketing approval of medical products. In this presentation, I will be highlighting some key points from the revised draft guidance on electronic system, electronic records, electronic signature, clinical investigations, specifically in relation to GCP inspections. The revised draft guidance provides information that helps to understand inspection expectations related to electronic systems and records. The views expressed in this presentation are those of mine and not necessarily those of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I have no financial interest to disclose. The objective of my presentation is to provide you perspective on GCP inspection related to the revised draft guidance on electronic systems, electronic records, and electronic signatures in clinical investigations. We'll be discussing about key elements in the revised FDA guidance that are related to GCP expectation, such as procedures and controls that are critical to ensure the authenticity, integrity, and when appropriate, the confidentiality of electronic records and electronic signatures, including validation of computer systems, access controls, external security safeguards, audit trails, and reports from audit trails, training, maintaining and retaining records, and digital health technology and source data, and documentation of processes and procedures related to computer system. To help us getting started, I have put a couple of challenge questions for you. After reading, please provide your answers to each question, and let's get started. Challenge question number 1 on elements of data quality. The fundamental elements of data quality and integrity expected from digital health technology are different from paper records. True or false? Electronic records, including from digital health technology, must meet the same fundamental elements of data quality and integrity expected of paper records. Therefore, the answer is false. Challenge question number 2 on regulatory requirements. Data generated from electronic clinical outcome assessment, such as ECOA, are not subject to similar regulatory requirements as data that come from paper source records. True or false? Data generated from computer systems, including those from electronic clinical outcome assessments, are subject to similar regulatory requirements as data that come from paper source records. In other words, electronic records are subject to the same regulatory expectation as paper records. Therefore, the answer is false. And thank you for participating to answer the challenge questions. The Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act requires new products to be safe and effective prior to marketing approval. And FDA determination on drug approval depend on the submission of reliable data from any source. As part of ensuring that new products are safe and effective prior to marketing approval here in the US, FDA has a comprehensive biosearch monitoring program of on-site inspection and data audits designed to monitor all aspects of the conduct and the reporting of FDA-regulated research. GCP inspections may be conducted by FDA to assess compliance with regulations. The inspection may also determine the validity and the reliability of data in support of marketing applications or regulated research. The objectives of BIMO inspection. The BIMO inspection program was established in 1977. Its objectives are to ensure the protection of the rights, safety, and welfare of human research participants involved in FDA-regulated clinical research, and to verify the accuracy and the reliability of study data submitted to FDA in support of research or marketing applications. Last but not least, it's also to assess compliance with FDA regulations. The BIMO inspection objectives are the same for electronic records as well as paper-based source records. FDA regulatory requirements that are relevant to BIMO inspections. Important regulations related to BIMO inspections are included on this slide. As stated before, it is essential to note that electronic data or records are subject to the same regulatory requirements as data and records from paper. Sponsors and investigators are expected to comply with all applicable regulatory requirements expected of paper records. Some of the regulations are listed on the left side of this slide, including the 21 CFR Part 312 that governs investigation on new drug application, Part 50 protection of human subjects, and Part 54 regulation that governs financial disclosure by clinical investigators, and Part 56 on institutional review boards, as well as other regulatory requirements. For today's discussion, Part 11 is the regulation we will be focusing on. That's described on the right side of the slide. Part 11 is the FDA regulation that establishes criteria under which the agency will accept electronic records and electronic signatures as equivalent to paper-based records and handwritten signatures. It is imperative to note that Part 11 is a companion regulation to other FDA regulations and laws called predicate rules, where specific requirements for issues such as record keeping, record content, signatures, and record retentions are addressed. The predicate rules mandate what must be Part 11 records. They also mandate the enforcement action that we take after inspections are conducted. For each record required to be maintained under the predicate rules, inspected entities are recommended to determine in advance whether they plan to rely on electronic or paper records to perform regulated activities. FDA regulatory requirements for electronic and paper records. Regardless of the types of records, the evidence submitted by a sponsor in a marketing application to support the safety and/or the effectiveness of a drug must satisfy the legal standards necessary for drug approval or licensing. Electronic records are subject to the same regulatory expectation as paper records. Compliance with the regulatory requirements will be validated in accordance with appropriate predicate rules during inspection. Let's look into the procedures and controls that fall under the scope of Part 11. The revised draft guidance is important to help ensure that the clinical trials are conducted consistent with the regulatory requirements and expectations. This draft guidance discusses about procedures and controls for electronic records, including elements such as validation, access controls, external security safeguards, audit trails, reports and audit reports, training, maintaining and retaining records, and documentation that are required, and the use of computer systems. It is crucial for all stakeholders involved in clinical trials to understand those elements from GCP inspection perspective to ensure compliance with the regulatory standards. Validation is critical to ensure that the electronic system is correctly performing its intended function. Consistent with FDA policy, sponsors and other regulated entities should use a risk-based approach for validating electronic systems owned or controlled by a sponsor or other regulated entities, taking into account the nature of the electronic system, the intended use of the electronic system, and the purpose and the significance of the record and the criticality of the data generated from those computer systems. During inspections, FDA inspectors identify computer system in use and assess the risk with the identified computer system. FDA inspection review activities related to electronic system validation, in particular when there are potential concerns with data reliability or data integrity. Access controls are important to safeguard the authenticity, the reliability, and the integrity of clinical trial data, and when appropriate, the confidentiality of electronic records. Access controls should be integral to electronic system, and regulated entities are expected to ensure that the access controls are in place in their computer systems. Access controls may include multi-factor authentication, strong login credentials, and biometrics such as facial recognition, fingerprints, voice prints, and iris scans, or any other kind of biometrics. During an inspection, regulated entity should maintain a list of authorized users and should demonstrate a grant role-based access to their computer systems. It is recommended to provide access only after ensuring that the site personnel or the sponsor staff have received the appropriate training to use the computer systems. FDA inspectors review access controls for electronic systems to determine whether clinical investigators or study personnel had authorized or unauthorized access to clinical trial information. They will work to identify and document any instances in which the clinical investigator or study staff had unauthorized access to restricted information, such as information related to masking or blinding. Security safeguards are crucial for the safety and privacy of study participants and for the reliability of data and the confidentiality of the study data. Clinical trial data may get affected by security breaches. The sponsors or other service providers should have security safeguards such as cybersecurity plans in place to prevent, detect, document, report, and remedy security breaches. Regulated entities such as sponsors and service providers are expected to have security safeguards to protect the confidentiality of the data, the reliability and the integrity of the data, and to prevent, detect, and mitigate effects of computer viruses, worms, or other potential harmful software code on the clinical trial data. Audit trails are critically important for the quality and integrity of the data as well as verifying clinical trial data. They are important to give context or meaning and to track changes to study data. Audit trails should describe when, by whom, and the reason changes were made to the data or record. Audit trails should be retained and made available during an inspection. They should not be modified or disabled too. Periodic review of audit trail helps to ensure data quality and integrity, and regulators such as FDA recommends to have a plan to conduct periodic review of the audit trails. During inspection, inspectors may review if electronic system contain audit trails and whether the audit trails fully capture the creation, modification, or deletion the system data, including the ability to capture the metadata. Inspectors also review a sample of the audit trails for electronic systems to determine whether electronic source data was entered contemporaneously at the time of collection. They also try to determine if the audit trail could be turned on and off, and when such functionality is available, if it was ever turned off during data capture and handling during the trial, and the reason why that was. Training is required to persons that develop, maintain, or use electronic record or electronic signature system to perform their assigned tasks. And those trainings should be conducted as applicable before the start of the clinical investigation, as needed when changes are implemented to electronic systems. Training and experience with electronic systems used in clinical investigation should be also documented. Current training materials should also be available to study personnel and participants during clinical study as needed. Inspections may need to verify whether the clinical investigators or sponsors or other service providers are qualified by training and experience to conduct the study. Inspectors determine whether those who use the electronic systems are provided training to perform the specific operation before use. Sponsors, investigators, and other regulated entities are required to retain electronic records for a prescribed period of time. There are various ways to retain electronic records, including in durable electronic storage devices and using cloud computing services. Sponsor, investigators, and other service providers should ensure that the confidentiality and integrity of original data and the meaning of the records are preserved. The relationship between records, source data, and all associated metadata should be preserved in a secure and traceable manner. During inspection, FDA may request to review records including all associated metadata and the audit trail information to reconstruct the clinical investigation. When systems are decommissioned and cannot be recommissioned, sponsors should ensure that files containing the metadata are retained and can be linked to corresponding data elements. FDA inspectors may verify that the sponsor maintain required records for the prescribed or pre-specified period of time. Inspectors try to determine if the sponsor had a process and procedure for retention and access to all records and data, including metadata associated with those records. During inspection, FDA inspectors may verify that the investigators maintain required records. Example would be like case report forms, informed consent, medical records, and progress notes from patients, and records of the disposition of drug, including dates, quantity, and the use of the investigation product by subjects for a prescribed period of time. Sponsors and investigators are required to retain the study-related records discussed before and for 2 years after drug approval, or if the drug is not approved until 2 years after shipment and delivery of the drug for investigational use is discontinued and FDA has been notified. For digital health technologies and for inspection purposes, electronic source data are considered to be located in the first durable electronic data repository. FDA currently does not intend to inspect individual digital health technology for source data. However, FDA may inspect data located in the first durable electronic data repository as applicable. All associated metadata should be securely transferred to and retained in the durable electronic data repository. During inspections, FDA inspectors determine if the sponsor provided the clinical investigators or to other stakeholders with information necessary to conduct the investigation properly prior to start of the clinical trial. Sponsor oversight of services, including those outsourced to service providers and activities associated with clinical investigation, should ensure that clinical trials are performed according to the protocol investigational plan and according to GCP as well as the applicable FDA regulatory requirements. FDA inspection will review and evaluate the sponsor's oversight of services with focus on service that apply significant role in a clinical trial. The inspection also tried to determine if the sponsor has the processes and procedures for selection of services and activities, and determine what criteria the sponsor may have used to identify and select the service providers, and whether those service providers meet the pre-specified criteria. For outsourced services, inspectors may collect copies of the agreement with the service providers between service providers and sponsors. They may determine if personnel have appropriate qualification and training, and they may look into standard office procedures and other relevant documentation to understand the sponsor's processes, and they may review the sponsor communication with third parties or service providers. Documentation for electronic systems by the sponsor or CRO or other regulated entities should be based on the nature of the electronic system, the intended use and the functionality of that electronic system, and the purpose and the significance of the record, as well as the criticality of the data generated from the electronic systems. For each study-specific protocol, the sponsor or CRO or other regulated entities should identify the electronic systems used to capture, collect, and create, or modify and maintain, or archive and retrieve or transmit electronic records pertinent to the clinical investigation. Sponsor or CRO or other regulated parties should provide documentation addressing important elements such as system setup and installation and system maintenance, validation plan and validation reports, the user acceptance test reports, and change control procedures. The list goes on, and audit trail information and training information and so forth. Similarly, at the investigator site, information regarding electronic system owned or controlled by the sponsor and CRO used in clinical investigation should be available. The sponsor should provide the clinical investigators with that information. This information may include policies and procedures related to system account setup and to system management, related to access controls and user access privileges, system user manuals and system training materials and records. The investigator should retain such information for review during regulatory inspection. In summary, understanding the revised draft guidance in connection with inspection is crucial to ensure that clinical trials are conducted in accordance with regulatory requirements. Before ending this presentation, it would be useful to emphasize the following points. Electronic records used in clinical investigations should be fit for purpose. Sponsors or investigators or other regulated entities should use a risk-based approach for designing and utilizing computer systems that are important in conducting clinical trials or regulated research by focusing on the data and the processes that matter most. Basic requirements, i.e. predicate rules for clinical trial data, do not change for paper, computer, or electronic records or hybrid approach. Inspections help to assess responsibilities for activities related to maintaining electronic system data integrity and procedures and controls for electronic records such as access control, audit trails, electronic system validation, training of users, and having appropriate standard procedures or documentation for use of the electronic systems. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Kassa and Beth. It's Leonard Sachs again. I'm just checking that you can hear me. I've had some technical difficulties getting into the webinar. I'm just about to begin with a couple of questions. So let's see. A lot of questions in here. Let's try this one. Where an electronic medical record serves as a source document in a clinical trial, should the EMR be Part 11 compliant? So again, when using an electronic health record as a source document, should the electronic health record be Part 11 compliant? I can start answering that one, and perhaps others can participate. We've stated in prior guidance on electronic source documentation that we do not expect electronic health records in themselves to be Part 11 compliant. They're not under the jurisdiction of FDA. But once those records are transported into an electronic data capture tool used by sponsors, that is the point at which Part 11 compliance is required. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has any thoughts. Perhaps Beth?
No, I have nothing to add, Leonard.
Greetings, everybody. We'll be getting back to the Q&A shortly. Leonard, we do have you off mute. We can hear you typing back there. So if you've got another question ready to go, feel free to read that out to folks. And if you want to direct that to specifically to Kassa or Beth to get them to weigh in, that'll be the best way. But since you're off mute, Leonard, please feel free to go ahead and bring up the next question. All right. It looks like Leonard is having a little bit of issues with his microphone. Ray Ford, is there any chance that you might be able to step in and take over reviewing some of the questions?
Absolutely. We have a question that came in for Beth Kunkoski, and here is the question for Beth. Can you please explain the relevance of 21 CFR Part 11 to real-world evidence studies intended to support new drug applications?
Thanks, I'd be happy to. Question one of the guidance actually touches on this a little bit, and that's now many clinical trials are actually using real world data, and a lot of these data sources come from systems that were not originally considered Part 11 compliant, such as a EHR or a registry. We recognize that there really is no way to make that source data Part 11 compliant. So you can still use that. However, there's a burden associated with that to the sponsor, where they need to ensure the quality and integrity of the data they're using to support their marketing application. So it takes a little extra legwork on the sponsor's part to really try and understand where that data come from and to ensure the integrity of that data. But it is definitely something that we are starting to see on a regular basis now.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions for you, Beth Kunkoski, and here's the next question. Regarding scanned records and storing in the electronic systems, does this fall into the definition of electronic records?
Yes. This guidance in particular definitely speaks to scanned electronic records that might be stored in an electronic system. Many industries are now moving towards totally paperless systems. And so, yes, those would certainly still be considered electronic records where Part 11 applies.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have a truckload of questions here for you, Beth Kunkoski. So here is the next question. As you mentioned that electronic records can be used to replace the original records, is it only for clinical documents or in a commercial environment as well?
Well, Ray, I can't really speak to the commercial environment. The context of the guidance in Part 11 in particular is clinical investigations and marketing submissions to the FDA. So we're really looking here at the clinical investigation documents. So I can't speak to the commercial side of things.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to the next question that came in. We do have a few more for Beth Kunkoski, and here's the next question. Do documents need to be certified if they are moved from an electronic format into another electronic platform? For example, from a network drive into a validated eTMF platform.
Thanks, Ray. So I'm trying to make sure I understand that question correctly, in that not all electronic records need to be certified, but I guess we tend to think more of electronic records as kind of the view access of, you have that original electronic source document, and there will be many parties that have access to that and the ability to see it. If you are truly moving a document from one place to another, there does need to be a trail associated with that so that you can ensure the integrity of that record in particular, and that it has not been altered. So that technically could be considered a certification process. It kind of depends on the context.
Thank you for responding to that question. We're going to move on. I saw a question highlighted for Kassa Ayalew, and here is the question. And it's regarding record integrity. There are often times a sponsor wants to remove a data field from an eCRF that held data. They are adamant and say that they will write a note to file saying that they are aware that removing the field will remove data as well. Is a NTF acceptable?
Thank you for the question. And any changes that would be made on electronic case report form should be agreed with the sponsor, with the clinical investigator. The investigator should agree the changes that would be made to the ECRF, as regarding the integrity of any kind of records. There is no difference between paper and electronic. Therefore, the ECRF should reflect what the clinical investigators have captured in the source, and therefore that needs to be looked at from a data integrity perspective. And if a change has to be made, the sponsor should communicate, and the clinical investigators have to have the agreement and the rationale to make those changes. And inspectors and regulators such as FDA should be able to understand exactly what those changes were and how those changes were made. And that's what I would say. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Dr. Ayalew, and here is the question. Are sponsors responsible and expected to ensure that the CRO electronic systems are validated to comply with Part 11?
Yes, and yeah, the sponsors are responsible to ensure that the system, not all the systems, relevant systems based on risk assessment, are appropriately validated, either by looking into the documents third parties like service providers like CRO have, or by potentially considering validating that system. Therefore, yes, they would be responsible. If the responsibility is transferred to the CRO, and meaning written agreement, if that responsibility is transferred to CRO, we would like to see if the sponsor has actually some documentation to know the system they will be using for their studies have been properly validated, or there are documentation to help the validation had occurred. Again, I mean, it depends on the particular system, the intended purpose of that system. Not all systems do require the same scope of validation or information. If it is, for example, I can throw this, something that to capture patient safety or primary endpoint, really important items for the study, it is very important for the sponsor to ensure that the CROs or service providers have the proper validation for that system at the beginning of the use, even when during the study, when things change. Back to you, Ray.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving back to our other panelists, Beth Kunkoski. We're still working with our tech team to help Dr. Sachs. And here is the next question for Beth Kunkoski. Could you please provide further information on the acceptability or the non-acceptability of DocuSign?
Thanks. I'd be happy to talk a little bit about DocuSign or Adobe Sign or any of those. There are many third-party electronic signature services out there. In my understanding, specifically speaking, we've worked with DocuSign, and my understanding is they have a specific life sciences or health sciences package, which they have worked to ensure that it complies with Part 11. And so it is really up to the sponsor and that third-party electronic signature service vendor to work out and ensure that you are using the Part 11 compliant system. I recognize there's usually a higher cost associated with that, but that is intended to ensure that it is specifically compliant with Part 11, and that does apply to, as I said, there are several commercial electronic signature services out there, and my understanding is that they all offer fairly comparable packages that they have specifically validated to be ensure they are compliant with Part 11.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have a few more questions for Beth Kunkoski, and here's the next question. Can EDCs be owned or hosted by sponsors with the appropriate security safeguards, or must they only be under the control of a third party or a clinical trial site?
Thank you. No, they can be hosted or sponsored by anyone, pretty much. There are now many third-party and specific clinical trial systems that are out there. However, it's always the sponsor's responsibility to ensure that it complies with Part 11. But you are welcome to provide those services within your own company or to contract that out to a third party.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question this round for Beth Kunkoski. And here is the question. When certified copies are made, does this mean that we do not have to retain the original record?
Thank you. And that one is another, it depends. The guidance talks a little bit about when you are, if you make a certified copy of a paper copy, and many times you are still going to retain that original source record. If, and many times now we are moving from a paper record to an electronic record and therefore moving to a paperless system. Many times that is possible. However, we also have a guidance that talks about electronic source data. And there are some times when you do want to retain that original paper source data record. So it does depend in what context you are moving from a paperless to electronic system.
Thank you for responding to that question. We're going to move back over to Dr. Kassa Ayalew. Got a few questions that came in, and here is the next question, or here's the first question. Is an audit trail review only recommended or is it mandatory?
Audit trail review is recommended, and I mean, audit trail is, as I think during the presentation mentioned, very important procedure to ensure data integrity, and also to inform the sponsors and clinical investigators on how the data had been modified and who may have modified the information. Therefore, it is critical for data integrity, and the proper review of that audit trail by all stakeholders at the sponsor level as well as the clinical investigator level is paramount. And as most of you know, we have enforcement discretion for during inspection for the audit trail. And but the audit trail, just we will be interested in audit trail when there are certain concerns, and it would benefit the sponsors and other stakeholders to have a periodic review of audit trail, which doesn't happen often, at least based on anecdotal experience. And there are recommendations and white papers out on how to review the audit trail, and I suggest that people to look into those kind of guidances on how to do audit trails for their studies. And again, it is very important to focus on audit trails for the important elements, risk-based kind of review of audit trails. Back to you, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question, and here's the question. Are there any regulations or guidance documents that prohibit the use of USBs in a GMP environment? There may be cases where USBs are needed to be used for data transfer.
I think as the introduction stated, I'm not from the GMP and I am from the clinical compliance evaluation, but the principle is the same. USB is just a hardware, a device to collect information or to gather and capture information, and the expectation would be the same, just like any other electronic record. And there is no any regulation that prohibits the use of USB. And of course, people may be talking about the safeguards, right? The potential security concerns in using USB. That needs to be taken into account, but there is no regulation or guidance that prohibits the use of USBs. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Dr. Ayalew, and here's the next question. Should all metadata be required, or is relevant metadata retention enough?
That's a great question, actually. It is, I think the ICH guidance may have something, and we encourage people to focus on relevant data. Whatever process and procedures, the focus should be in doing the expected activities for relevant data. And the risk-based approach or the risk proportionate approach is intended to encourage all the stakeholders to focus on relevant data. Back to you, Ray.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions that came in for Dr. Ayalew. And here's the next question. Is it recommended to retain paper copies of signed 1571s or 1572s if there's a retained electronically, if they're retained electronically with certification?
No, there is no requirement to have both. If the source originally, if the information is captured electronically, unless a person wants to have additional copy, there is no such a requirement to have a paper record. Thank you, Ray. Back to you.
All right, we have one more question this round for Dr. Ayalew, and here's the question. The EMA guideline on CS is focusing on the dynamic file retention for metadata captured dynamically. The FDA document seems to accept static forms of retention of data. Is this correct? If yes, is there a specific reason for the different approach?
That's correct, and that's also a great question. And FDA also prefers to have dynamic data when it comes to assessing metadata or audit trail. However, we recognize also in some instances, and some stakeholders may not have that ability to have the dynamic data, and they may have a static data, such as like a PDF document containing information related to audit trail. That's the reason why we are embracing both. But we recommend, and if it's possible, to have the dynamic data, and because it allows us easily to navigate through the audit trail, to review and verify the audit trail. And it is somehow similar to what EMA is suggesting, except that we recognize that some stakeholders may not have the ability to generate dynamic data. Instead, they may have the static data. Thank you. Back to you, Ray.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We're going to move back over to the top of the lineup, Beth Kunkoski. We've got some more questions that just came in. And here is the first question. Are all individual electronic signature users required to submit a letter of non-repudiation?
Thank you, Ray. Yes, Part 100C1 of the regulation does talk about non-repudiation letters, and it is a required part of the regulation. What we do see most sponsors do is submit one general letter for their entire organization. And in that letter, it specifically says anyone, it's just a broad overarching anyone within our company that submits the letter, we're certifying that the handwritten signature is equivalent to a electronic signature.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions that came in for Beth Kunkoski, and here's the next question. Our EMR system does not have a Part 2 certification available to us. I told them they must provide it, and they say it is not required. Is that true?
Part 11 certification, yes. So most electronic medical record or electronic health record systems are not Part 11 compliant. And we do have a specific guidance that talks about electronic health records, and in that guidance there is additional information on why we recognize that many of these are not organizations are not regulated by FDA, and so we can't enforce Part 11 compliance on many of these systems that most hospitals use.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions that came in, and here's the next question. Every entry in an electronic record for a clinical trial needs to have an e-signature, or could we leverage a risk-based approach to determine where e-signature is required or where the login information is enough to attribute the data entry?
Thank you for that question. I'm not quite sure what is meant by every entry in an electronic record of a clinical trial. Does that have to have a signature? In general, not every electronic record in a investigation actually needs to have an electronic signature. There's actually only a handful of required records that require electronic signatures, such as the 1572 investigator agreements. And those are the ones that you should focus on ensuring you have a electronic signature that is compliant with Part 11.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions, and here's the next question. Is there a way to confirm if a sponsor that has been working with FDA for several years has filed a letter of repudiation if this isn't clear due to staff turnover? If not, how should the letter of repudiation be addressed? Resubmit and possibly risk a redundant submission?
Thank you for that question. There is not a specific method to verify that you have submitted a letter of non-repudiation and that it is on file. Now that we are using the electronic submission gateway in order to gain access to that system, you generally have been required to submit a letter of non-repudiation. So that should be one way to be able to gauge if you have that account and can currently access it. It likely has been submitted. However, if you aren't sure, feel free to go ahead and submit that again. Now, again, you can do that electronically and you don't need to send a paper copy.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got one more question in this round before moving on to the next panelist. And here's the final question for Elizabeth Kunkoski in this round. Acknowledging that signatures drawn with a finger or stylus are actually handwritten signatures, would this extend to signatures drawn using a computer mouse, for example? Signatures drawn using a computer mouse versus a finger or stylus can vary greatly in quality and execution.
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. Section 11.3 of the regulation defines handwritten signatures, and in that it says the act of signing with a writing or marking instrument such as a pen or stylus is preserved. I could probably argue that it is the act of signing that is being preserved, even if you are using a mouse. So that is probably a reasonable way to use a handwritten signature. However, as you mentioned, it's often not the most legible format. So I don't know if that would be recommended, but it is truly the act of signing that is preserved that we are most interested in for considering something a handwritten signature.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We're going to move on to Dr. Kassa Ayalew for this next round of questions. And here's the first question. Is it necessary to validate the systems that are used for studies which are not intended for regulatory submissions?
Well, thank you very much, Ray. Thank you for the question. For regulatory purpose, I mean, the recommendation or the draft guidance that we are discussing today is mainly addressing studies that are being regulated by FDA or will be regulated by FDA. Therefore, the recommendation about validation is related to regulated research. However, I mean, sometimes people start with the purpose to conduct a study that they may eventually use the information for regulatory purpose. And having a validation is not going to in any way harm, but it's up to the sponsor or the stakeholder to determine whether to conduct validation or not for system that are intended for non-regulated activity. That's what I would say. Thank you very much, Ray. Back to you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions that came in for Dr. Ayalew, and here is the next question. Does FDA expect direct access to the EMR systems to verify data during an inspection, or are certified copies generated from such systems adequate?
The FDA during inspection would like to access, I mean, as applicable, the source system. In this case, I think the example the person provided is the EMR, and if the EMR is used for regulated activity, we would like to have a direct access as applicable. But certified copies of electronic records or paper records would be also acceptable. And of course, the expectation is certified copies, or they would need to contain the appropriate metadata and the audit trail, and they should be preserved the way they were originally created. Therefore, both options are possible, but if there is an original source records and during inspection, we would prefer to access the source record if it is available. Back to you, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions, and here's another question on Part 11 of paper records. Does Part 11 apply to paper records kept in lieu of electronic records? Would it apply to computer printouts of source documents initially recorded on a personal or business computer?
If somebody uses a computer just to generate, for example, a paper printout, that computer, for example, a Word document, that computer may be seen as a typewriter. But it should be, I think it's very important when we talk about electronic records, from creation to archiving, that is, I mean, if they intentionally, the computer system was used to generate records for regulatory purpose, that would be the source. But printout is not going to be, that would be considered as a paper record. And I'm not sure if I answered the proper question, the question properly, and maybe missing some elements. But it just, if a computer is used to print out something, that's not going to be considered as an electronic record. Back to you, Ray. I'm sorry.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Kassa Ayalew in this round, and here is the question. When inspecting clinical research sites using sponsor-provided systems and data integrity concerns are discovered regarding missed entries, possibly due to computer glitches, would that be a site-level violation, failure to report, or a sponsor-level violation, failure to have adequate systems?
It could be both, and but it depends. And if the missed entry is related to, for example, to a clinical investigator activity, that could be related to the clinical investigator responsibility. It could be also system related. It could be if the system is owned by somebody, a third party or a sponsor, potentially that could be also a result of that system. Therefore, as discussed during the presentation, that tells us there is an issue with the system that potentially impacts data integrity or data reliability. At the end, what matters is what was that missing entry. If if it is very relevant, if it is important to patient safety, to data reliability and data integrity, we may take that seriously. But if it is something that doesn't impact the patient's right, the patient's safety and well-being, as well as the data reliability, integrity, and it doesn't impact the expectation by regulators, that may be okay too. Therefore, the violation could be at the investigator site, it could be at BALS, or it could be at the sponsor. Thank you. Back to you, Ray.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving back to our other panelists, we've got a few more questions that came in for Beth Kunkoski. And here's the first question. Does the statement, please use the Adobe Acrobat self-sign plugin to insert your signature on fillable FDA forms, outlining the policy's guidance on important information about digital electronic signatures, still apply for FDA submissions for FDA forms and cover letters?
Thank you, Ray. Yes, that is still a valid form, and you should follow the instructions on any specific FDA form before it is submitted. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions, and here's the next question. What kind of certifications or documentation are required to be furnished by the commercial off-the-shelf electronic signature platforms to confirm that they are Part 11 compliant? Does FDA look into those documents, or is it the customer's responsibility for the verification part?
Thank you. Yes, Section C of the guidance on information technology service providers and services talks a little more about kind of the relationship between the sponsor and any third-party IT service providers and what information needs to be on file versus provided by the third party. So usually the third party or vendor has a lot of that information available, but then it is the regulated entity's responsibility to review those documents and ensure that Part 11 compliance is met. If you then are inspected, I think question 19 of the guidance talks a little more of the FDA might look into that, but it's the sponsor's responsibility to have that information available.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got another question on Part 11, and here's the question. Are there any plans to update Part 11?
Thank you, Ray. I can say that the recent technical amendment was actually a pretty exciting undertaking to no longer require paper records. So we do consider that a update to the regulation. And as Leonard mentioned, Part 11 is more than 20 years old. A lot of changes have taken place in the electronic world since then. However, our regulation process is a little on the slow side. We've certainly talked about it, but nothing is going to happen very quickly. If we were to do something, we would certainly go out with a draft that would be open to comment and would then be taken under advisement before anything was made final. So we certainly have talked about it, but it's not a speedy process.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a question that came in on DHT, and here's the question. When DHT is used for trial, which uses public network to transmit data to sponsor, and the DHT is not meeting Part 11 requirement, can the data received by the sponsor, is it considered as a source or raw data?
Thank you. The DHT section of the guidance, I think it's question 23, talks about the source data collected by the DHT, and that we are considering, once the data is transferred to the first durable electronic data repository, that is what is truly considered your source data, and we are not expecting Part 11 compliance with the DHT itself.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Elizabeth Kunkoski, and here's the next question. What if a clinical document is wet signed but has a typed in date, for example, 1572? Should that adhere to the Part 11 rules and be rejected from a compliance perspective?
Thank you, Ray. It's not clear if it is a paper or electronic document. If it is a paper document with a wet signature, the date could be handwritten or typed. With an electronic record, also if it can have a handwritten signature and the date to be typed in.
Thank you for responding to those questions. Moving back over to Dr. Kassa Ayalew, we have a very long question, and we're going to have 5 minutes left. We're going to try to get this in. And here's the question. Where multiple organizations are involved in a clinical investigation, like a sponsor, CRO, an investigator site, what are the expectations of FDA for meeting the general requirements of Part 11.100? Is the sponsor required to ensure unique signatures and verifying the identity of signatories of the third-party organizations when signatures are required on study records, for example, training records, reports, study logs? Would an agreement between all parties stating that they will ensure Part 11.100 requirements be met within the organization, is that acceptable?
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for the question. Irrespective of the number of, I think almost all the studies involve a lot of organizations these days. And the expectation in terms of complying Part 11 would remain the same, whether the organization is a single organization or multiple organization. Of course, it depends on the role the different organization and stakeholders would play. If there is, for example, a contracted kind of a CRO kind of activity, and if the CRO takes that particular responsibility, one may expect that the CRO to take that responsibility for the function. But if there are like service providers, or traditionally we call vendors, and it will be up to the sponsor to ensure those parties meet the Part 11 expectation. And it is very important that I want to emphasize to know the requirement under the predicate rule, because the predicate rule mandates what we do with Part 11. Are the records required records to have signature, electronic signature, or verify the people who would be signing on those documentation, and that may help to narrow down an expectation. Therefore, it is up to the sponsor to identify those kind of activities first, and to make sure that whether those activities are required by the predicate rule, and then of course verifying those people if for those activities that are required under the predicate rule, to ensure that people who will be signing have the proper verification. Thank you very much, Ray. Back to you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got just beyond a minute left. We're going to try to get in one more question for Dr. Ayalew, and here's the question. Will FDA still evaluate, or have already evaluated, on the content of the MHRA guidance on data integrity, the EMA guidance on computerized systems, to align on the requirements? And is there any collaboration between the regulatory authorities?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Ray, and thank you for the question as well. Yeah, FDA has a long-standing collaboration with both organizations, with AMA as well as MHRA, and we do exchange information, and we do work to converge our processes, our expectations. And as you know, one tool is, for example, from a GCP perspective, the ICH E6 guidance, and the R2, and the one that will be hopefully coming very soon, the RC guidance. That's intended to have a converged kind of expectation, including on data integrity, on the other guidances. And the bottom line here is, yeah, we do have and we do review those guidances, and we work to align and to learn from each other when it comes to ensuring GCP and patient safety, as well as expectation from regulators. Thank you very much, Ray. Back to you.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. A huge thank you to our presenters and our panelists for their very informative and timely talk, and also for responding to numerous questions that came in.